Welcome back. We ended the last lecture with the visualization of the reduced economic efficiency and output from unionization, whose negotiations focus solely on wages. Now, it's important to note that this is not the same results for, like, back in the day, looking at coal miner unions demanding safety. This is specifically looking at when the negotiations focus on wages. However, what we saw earlier in that previous example was really the worst case scenario. And what we would expect if the negotiation process was simply unions making a single demand and firms accepting it and firing people. No negotiation back and forth, no other things being considered. But really, that's not realistic. And through the negotiation process, firms and unions can reach agreements that benefit one party without costing the other party too much. So until now, we looked at the position of firms' labor demand curve and the union's ability, or excuse me, utility function. But in reality, firms and unions negotiate back and forth with each other. This can bring them off of the labor demand curve in our simple model. And this is what we're going to be exploring in this lecture. So we're going to drive a firm's isoprofit curve over this next slide so we can see how firms and unions will negotiate. This is like the first step. Excuse me. The isoprofit curve shows the combination of workers and wages that yield the same level of profit. So each point on the line will have different wages and a different number of workers that are being employed, but the profit is going to remain the same. So this figure here on this slide shows two isoprofit lines. So this one curve here has a profit level of $150,000 for the firm, while this one up here has a profit level of $100,000. So any point on this line, the firm will have a profit of $100,000. Now, as we go higher away from the origin, the profit is going to fall. That's because the firm's being higher up represents a higher labor cost for the firm. So of course, that's going to take away from their overall profits. So at this point here at P, the firm makes $100,000 in profit and they hire 100 workers at a wage of W0. Now they could slightly increase the number of workers to 150. Out here at this point along that curve, they'd earn the same amount of profit, but they'd have to pay the workers slightly less. So let's real quick, we'll say if the wage is set at W0 in the market, so if it's determined by, the overall market, by supply and demand, that equilibrium wage is set at W0, the firm is going to choose this point P on this isoprofit line. Of course, they could choose a point on a higher isoprofit line up here, where there would be multiple points that match, 2 points that match that wage, way below 100 workers, way above 100 workers. However, at that isoprofit line or curve, because it's farther up, it's going to represent a lower level of profit. So this point P is the point where at that wage, the firm is able to maximize their profit. So we're going to start building towards the efficient contract model. Right now, looking at the firm and union decision making. So this is the utility function right here for the labor union, or the utility level of U star. Right here is the firm's ISO profit. Initially, the equilibrium wage, W star, at that point, the firm will hire E star workers, right where this utility function, the indifference curve for the labor union, just barely touches in one point their tangent to the isoprofit curve here. So the firm earns a profit of pi star, and the labor union gets a utility level of U star. So we can see here that initial point, but we've added a few more indifference curves and, excuse me, the indifference curve here, and then the two isoprofit curves up there. So if the union was a monopoly union, like we walked through in the early example, using what we saw, they would demand wages at point M, so way up here. This will end up, this is along this demand curve, where the utility or the indifference curve at this utility level UM for the union is tangent to that curve. This is a higher wage and they would be offering an equilibrium or earning an equilibrium. And there's a lower level of employment up here. So because this indifference curve is greater than the original indifference curve for the union, if they're able to negotiate this monopoly union wage up here, that's going to increase their level of utility. But look at the firm's isoprofic curve. So the firm's isoprofic curve moves from pi star down here, past this curve up here, all the way up to pi m up here. Because this is farther from the origin, it represents a lower profit for the firm. So they're doing much worse than they were initially. But the firm doesn't have to simply accept this offer from the union like we worked through in the previous example. They could supply a counteroffer. In this case, the firm would be happy to offer the wage level at point Q here. At this point, the wage is greater than the initial wage. It's up here instead of down here, but it's not quite as generous as what the monopoly union wage would prefer. However, it's on this indifference curve here, the same indifference curve as this higher wage. So the union would be indifferent between this point M here and the point Q down here, because while they may be receiving lower wages per worker, it's not only a smaller decrease of employment, it's actually an increase in employment. We're moving to the right of the initial employment level. So for the union, they would be likely to accept wages here. It's a reasonable offer from the firm. The firm can improve their profit. They're moving from an ISO profit line up here down to here, which improves their situation. And moving from M down to Q here is the same. The union is indifferent between the two options. As my hero Billy Mays used to say, but wait, there's more. Look at point R out here. Here the firm is receiving the same level of profit as they were at point M. So if we're looking on this previous ISO profit line, moving from here all the way down through here, the firm is indifferent between those 2 points. But the union moves from this curve, at this level of utility, to increase their utility out here at this indifference curve. So that means they would be better off moving from M, this point here, out to R, this point here. Even though they're giving up some wages, they're gaining a lot more in employment for the workers that are members of the union. So if they think the firm would be likely to accept this wage right here, this WM, they would be like, it would benefit them if they would offer this slightly lower wage, but more employment up here. They would make themselves better off, and the firm would be no worse off than if they accepted this higher wage at point M. So let's think about this. At point Q, right here, the firm is better off than this monopoly wage here, and the union is indifferent. At point R here, the firm is the same, just as bad off, they're on the same ISO profit line, so it's this exact same level of profit for them. They're different between the two, but the union is on a higher indifference curve, so they have greater utility from that, so they're better off there. So for the union and the firm, it pays to negotiate because through either of these options, one can benefit, or any point in between Q and R, both will have some benefit compared to this original point M. So while the monopoly union, that very simple model suggests that we would see higher wages and less employment at this point up here, if it's just the initial offer, through negotiation, we can see employment level actually increase in some cases, and the wage not increase quite as much, and both parties be made better off than if they would have accepted that initial wage. There's no negotiation back and forth. So both parties can make themselves better off by negotiating and offering a different wage employment combination. Now, in this example, point Z along the isoprofit curve, pi Z, so this one right here, leading to point Z there, is the maximum wages that the firm can pay and still break even. This is basically how the textbook defines that curve. Any deviation away from this point along the isoprofit line or the indifference curves are going to reduce the utility for one of the two parties. So they're unlikely to agree to it once the deal has been reached somewhere. I'm sorry, this is called the contract curve, this from P to Z. Any deviation from a point on this line, so either moving in this way or moving out that way, will reduce the utility for one of the parties. So basically, they're unlikely to agree to it. Once they start to move in this direction, they're not going to move away from it. Someone's going to be worse off. So any wage employment combination along this line is called an efficient contract. Now, if the firm and union agree on that efficient contract, then the employment level is going to increase. So note that the agreement is to the right of the original demand curve. So going back, the original demand curve is here. The employment levels are going to be somewhere out here. So it's greater than we initially saw, either with our simple supply and demand model with no union involvement or with the monopoly union with the negotiation. Excuse me. So that means basically the firm is going to be overstaffed. They'll have more workers than are necessary. In our monopoly union model, the firm accepted the higher wage, and the wage was the only thing that was being negotiated on. But here, that's not the case. You have the firm and the union negotiating over both the wage and the employment level, taking both into consideration. Now, there's an old term called feather bedding, which is useful to describe this practice. Basically, as part of their agreement with the union, firms end up hiring more workers than are necessary, and it's known by both sides of this negotiation. So the firm may hire extra staff in a supervisory role that doesn't really provide much. They may have extra people on staff and create new make work tasks for them, or even have some no-show jobs where people don't actually have to show up to the office or spend very little time actually working. Now, because the efficient contract line was upward sloping, that means that as firms move from point P all the way out to point Z along that curve, they would also increase the level of employment. But that's not always the case. In some extreme examples, the efficient contract line is vertical. That means that for each wage level, the firm is going to hire the same amount of workers. And we call that a strongly efficient contract. I don't want to dig into this too much, and you're not going to have specific questions asking you to mess around with this like the original one, but I do want to touch on this at least a little bit because I think it's important. And here we can see that idea visually where we have this vertical line right here. So we're not seeing an increase in employment as the wages go up, like we saw here, where the curve is sloping upwards. Here, the employment level is set at E star. The only question is what the wage is going to be. At any wage that the firm and union agree to, we'll end up with the same number of workers. But again, there are many different wages that these employees could be hired for. Where they fall on that line is going to determine how the profits are shared between the union and the firm. So if they agree on point P here, the firm is going to keep all the profit. As they move higher up this curve towards point Z, the union is going to capture more and more of those profits. And all the way at point Z here, the firm is going to break even. Remember, the textbook defines point Z like this curve is the break-even point. So as they reach that point, the firm breaks even, and the union is able to capture all the profits. Anywhere in between, point R, point Q, anywhere on this line, the firm is going to capture some, and the union is going to capture some. I also don't want to dig into the evidence on efficient contracts too much. I know I've got two different courses in this, like one single course. Those in the HR program really don't need to go through the evidence on efficient contracts, whether this holds or not. But I do think it's important sometimes to highlight whether or not these theories that we have actually match reality. So there has been some empirical evidence done. There's been some studies done that attempt to estimate the demand curve for a firm or for a unionized industry, and they look at the actual observed employment levels. Basically, what they tend to find is that the employment levels are not on that estimated demand curve, that they are to the right, just as we had shown in a simple way through this model. I will stop there because this is already going long, and in their next lecture video, we'll pick up with strike behavior and the decision for the union to strike.